Often I forget. So we are recording. So good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Planetary Pause series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today our guest is Susan NEIMAN, the director of the Einstein Forum in Berlin, Germany. She's also the author of Learning from the Germans, an extraordinary probe into the nuanced forms of evil and racism. Interviewing people both in East and West Germany and U.S. southern states, NEIMAN weaves a compelling series of stories into a tapestry for healing. She was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and studied philosophy at Harvard and the Free University of Berlin. She holds a PhD in philosophy from Harvard and has been a professor of philosophy at Yale University and at Tel Aviv University in Israel, before becoming director of the Einstein Forum in Berlin. Her background, which includes years of living in the U.S. South, Germany, and Israel, has given her a unique perspective into how racism and xenophobia emerge and persist and what we can do about it. Her books include Slow Fire, Jewish Notes from Berlin, The Unity of Reason, Rereading Kant, A Guide for Grown-Up Idealists, and my favorite title, Why Grow Up? Subversive Thoughts for an Infantile Age, which we are definitely living in the midst of right now. So
It was published in 2015. It wasn't thinking about it.
I know it was. I know it wasn't, but it's perfect time. You seem to be ahead of the time all the time here. Her book, Learning from the Germans, was selected by the Praxis Book Club for our July meeting, and it inspired one of the most exciting and deep discussions to date. So we are really happy to have you here with us. Welcome, Susan NEIMAN.
Well, it's a pleasure, and thank you for those kind words. I love the expression tapestry for healing. So that's I'll remember that. It's very, very nice.
Maybe John, you can just type that into the message. I have someone helping me here today so that I don't forget.
I just linked her website and the book that we were primarily talking about.
Great, thank you, John. And also put in about readers' books because people can order her books from readers in Sonoma, or
Gotcha.
You can order them online from everywhere except Amazon.
I should also say that there is a paperback edition coming out on September 8th,
Great.
which includes a new afterword about, well, what was happening in the world until June 24th. So who knows between now and September 8th, but it was talking about the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and the pandemic.
Right. I have that addendum, as you said.
Brings it up to date a little bit, though.
It was up to date even before in many ways. And I'm going to ask you some of those questions because it was amazing to me how you zeroed in on things that have become really important in our country since that book was published. So I have lots of questions which we won't get to, but I will get to, I hope, some of the most important ones. One that's always a big issue in the US, and it seems like Germany has dealt with it a lot better, is the issue of free speech. You mentioned that in Germany, Nazi symbols, Holocaust denial, and hate speech are illegal.
Yes.
And yet in the US, this kind of hate speech is often protected by our Constitution. So I would be interested to know from you, how do you feel Germany's position on making such language and behavior illegal affected its ability to deal with the past?
It's a good question. And I think it was definitely helpful. I mean, I think we have seen, unfortunately, particularly with the kind of abuse that social media makes possible, we have seen just how powerful, untrammeled free speech can be. I was after watching President Obama's magnificent eulogy for John Lewis last night, I very rarely watch Fox News. I think that it's kind of my civic duty to watch it occasionally, but I find it so difficult that I don't perform that civic duty all that often. But I watched Tucker Carlson, and it's only 8 minutes. It's worth looking at because it's a completely alternative reality. He was very, very critical of the speech. But everything else he said, I mean, it was very Alice in Wonderland-y, as it were. If somebody who hadn't been following the news for a while looked at it, I don't know what they would think. Look, I would be very happy if the United States could see its way to rethinking the First Amendment. That, of course, should include re-looking at the Roberts Court decision that unlimited campaign contributions are a form of free speech. I mean, what we have is a very perverse, you know, originalism about the Constitution, which in fact isn't original at all. In the same way that there's among many people, a sanctification of the Second Amendment, which was not meant to say that every 18-year-old can buy an unlimited number of assault rifles or machine guns, you know? So, I mean, in short, I think that it's been helpful. Now, in Germany now, of course you have backlash. And I think that's something that you always have to remember and account for. If something is against the law, some kid will get a kick out of drawing a swastika. No, you know, because it's provocative, all right? But if those kinds of provocations are punished, you know, you have a general sense of leadership and trust in a well-functioning government that I think has been very helpful, although it isn't perfect.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because I think there might be a way, and maybe you have some ideas on it, that we could reframe free speech or explain it in a different way. Just like you mentioned with the Second Amendment, that's become sanctified in a way and misunderstood in its sanctification. And the First Amendment, I'm questioning that it's not misunderstood because you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That would be considered illegal. So do you have any ideas just quickly how we might be able to frame it in a way that people could see that it's just as outrageous as calling fire in a crowded theater?
Well, I mean, one could simply say that. One could, you know, talk about the ways in which we've unfortunately seen in the last 3.5 years that, you know, certain forms of freedom of speech have been calls to violence that have led to death.
Right.
But I also think that, you know, again, if you put this originalist insistence on free speech together with the Roberts courts, with the Citizens United decision that unlimited corporate spending is a form of speech.
It's horrifying.
You know, you sort of realize that, I mean, the Constitution, first of all, the Constitution was made by human beings. Even if you believe the Bible was dictated to Moses on Mount Sinai, it's, you know, and there are people who believe that it has a, you know, the Constitution has a very different status. And, you know, I think the idea of reconsidering that status entirely, historicizing the Constitution. It was, you know, it was written a very long time ago in a very different world.
Right.
You know, I would love it if those kinds of debates could take place, you know, in some sort of reasonable and, you know, non-angry, you know, sort of religious war terms. It's interesting to me. I talk in the book. I interviewed. Sorry that I'm just a bit late and I'm forgetting his name. Charles Reagan Wilson, a great Southern historian who has written about the ways. I mean, he's written about a lot of things, but he became famous for a book that talked about ways in which the Confederacy and their descendants used the Bible and used this originalist interpretation of the Bible. And it's actually really interesting to look at this one picture because they used the Bible to say, well, look, there were slaves in the Bible, so clearly there's nothing wrong with slaves.
Right.
If the Bible says it's okay. Now, abolitionists also used the Bible. If you think about John Brown, who was a very, very committed Christian, but many other people as well, and they were saying, look, there are these biblical principles of, whether you look at the Old or the New Testament, you look at the Old Testament, you're talking about justice. And indeed, although there were slaves, they had to be freed after 7 years, interestingly enough. But, or if you look at the New Testament and you talk about brotherly love and equality, but those are somewhat abstract, and you can get an originalist saying, but they had slaves in the Bible, so it must be okay. And I asked him, do you think this is the reason why you have originalists about the Constitution as well on the right?
I think that's a good point.
Yeah, and of course, so I'm a philosopher, I get to say these things. He said, well, I'm a historian. It's hard for me to exactly assert it. Historians are very careful about drawing parallels if there's not sort of archival evidence or something to back it up. But I actually think there's a deep connection with originalism about the Bible and originalism about the Constitution.
I call those Christians Leviticans.
Right, yes.
Because that's where they're getting all their information.
Indeed.
Primarily.
Yeah, somebody, I don't know who, maybe this is a while ago, a text that was circulated about, if you're going to be originalist about, I don't know, this or that in the Bible, are you going to, it listed a whole thing. It's not just stoning people, it was bizarre practices from Leviticus.
Well, there was one that you could sell your children.
Right, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, there was things like that.
Yeah.
Before we get back into the U.S., I want to go back to Germany because I think some of this is really interesting. You mentioned that prior to the unification of Germany, when the wall came down in '89, that the East Germans tend to be anti-fascist, where the West Germans were anti-communist. And I thought that was a very interesting observation. And how did that play out? Because the other thing you said, that when the unification came between the two parts of Germany, that East Germany didn't really become free. It became colonized by the West. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that.
The colonization, so we need to be very careful.
Okay.
A majority of East Germans did at the time vote for reunification with West Germany. They were not, however, the people who led the peaceful revolution. The people who led the peaceful revolution wanted a kind of third way. They wanted a socialist state that got rid of censorship and allowed people to travel, but basically they were committed to socialism, and they did, these were people who were real activists who had risked quite a bit to push for change in the GDR. But they were not a majority of the population. The majority of the population did vote. Now, the thing is, they really didn't know what they were getting into. Mm-hmm. And, they had lived for 40 years with a set of social rights so strong that they couldn't imagine a state without them. I mean, the GDR guaranteed, for example, a right to housing and a right to work, along with a lot of other things that are guaranteed by the West German Constitution, which, however, doesn't guarantee housing or a right to work. It does have reasonably decent, compared to America, it has a heavenly version of social rights, but it did not have what East Germany had. So suddenly people found themselves in a situation that they could not have quite imagined. There was also a strong attempt to close down East German businesses, to remove any teacher, any professor, anybody in the media on the grounds that they had been close to the regime. Mm-hmm. And so many East Germans, when I want to say I'm quoting many East Germans who call this a colonization. I wouldn't quote it if I didn't think there was something in it. Right. I do, but I'm quoting East Germans. So I want to just be very careful about that.
Right, I understand. I just think it's interesting how East and West Germans actually reacted quicker. The East Germans, I think, reacted quicker to dealing with the past and the Holocaust than the West Germans. Is that correct?
Well, very much so, because you see, the Nazis' first targets were not Jews. They were communists and socialists.
Mm-hmm.
We all know this very famous quote of Martin Niemöller. I mean, it's printed all over the place in English in the US. First they came for the communists, but I was a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I wasn't a socialist. You know, and then by the time they came for me, there was nobody left to defend me. But all of that's just a description of what happened. I mean, they came for the Jews much later than they came for communists and socialists. And, that means that the people who became the leadership of East Germany had been genuine anti-fascists from the very beginning, had either been in exile to have their lives saved or in a concentration camp. So this was not, this was not lip service. This was not something to, play up to the Soviet allies. This was a very genuine and deep anti-fascism. I'm hesitant. At the moment, I'm kind of obsessed with Paul Robeson. You're all of an age where I think you might know who Paul Robeson is. Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, I won't go into that, but he's honored in the GDR, or in the former East Germany. There's still a Paul Robeson Straße. There's a Paul Robeson choir. And, the kind of as he said in his HUAC testimony, wherever I have been, the first people who fell in the fight against fascism were always communists. And so it's a deep conviction, which was just simply not the case in West Germany. In West Germany, except for the very top leadership, Konrad Adenauer, almost everyone, I don't just mean in the government, I mean in the police, I mean in the schools, I mean in the intelligence agencies, the foreign service, almost all of them were old Nazis. Mm-hmm. So while there were some old Nazis left in the GDR, it was nothing like at the level and the proportion of the West.
Yeah, that's a very interesting distinction. And now I'm going to go back a little bit to the U.S. In your book, you mentioned that the South has had a disproportionate influence on American politics, which I think we've noticed with all the Southern presidents we've had. It's just been one after another, usually. And you said something, quote, that I thought was really interesting. Quote, American political culture is an attempt to win the Civil War by other means. Would you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. One of the insights that I had, and again, this got confirmed by the same historian, Charles Reagan Wilson, when I was talking to him, was the way in which resistance to Reconstruction became resistance to anything that comes from Washington. Of course, we've seen this very odd feature in the last month. I mean, could we imagine had Obama sent federal troops to a state against the wishes of the state's governor, you would have had the states' rights people screaming about it. Okay, so we're in this parallel universe right now that we can go into or not as you choose, but Reagan Wilson told me that it was very, very explicit with Strom Thurmond and Eastland and other people up through the 60s to actually oppose any federal program because today the word is triggered. It triggered memories of Reconstruction. And that's quite extraordinary because, of course, you have people, it's not just in Alabama or Mississippi, it's in Oregon, it's in Indiana, it's all over the place. But that root opposition to the federal government does come from a resistance to Reconstruction, comes from our absolute ignorance of Reconstruction. And by the way, as I try to say in the book, I was just as ignorant as anybody else until I started studying this stuff. 5 years ago. People, Hillary Clinton confused Reconstruction and Jim Crow in a speech that she gave in 2016. That is how, now she wouldn't do that anymore because we have all been educated through this public discussion, but it was just that whole mess back there is basically how we've been taught to look at that. Unless we're one of the few people who's read W.B. Du Bois's doorstopper of a book on Reconstruction, or Eric Foner's shorter book for anybody who wants to read a contemporary view. But, that is, I think, still a deep undercurrent of American thought, certainly of American right-wing thought.
Mm-hmm. Well, that goes right into the next question, because I think it's very interesting that when you published your book, the Black Lives Matter movement hadn't begun and the toppling of statues hadn't started here, and yet it seemed like you almost anticipated it with some of the things that you were writing.
Well, let's wait a second. Most people date the Black Lives Matter movement from the death of Trayvon Martin, which was
Well, probably, yeah, but the big movement really started recently.
Right.
And you mentioned something about the statues toppling, and one thing that we learned and we talked about in our book club was none of us had known, as you said you hadn't either, that the statues that were erected to commemorate the war figures in the Civil War were not erected right after the Civil War. It was years later, basically to keep this whole idea of what the Old South was alive, which kept racism alive, which kept that whole idea. And you mentioned something that also I thought was very interesting, that statues and monuments are values brought to life.
Yes.
I'd like you to talk about that.
Well, I get quite frustrated with the whole, they're tearing down our history, they're tearing down our heritage discourse, which, by the way, you also are now having in England and in Holland and Belgium, as, much as you're having in the United States, because, we don't memorialize every piece of our history, right? I mean, you don't put up a statue to your Aunt Mildred unless your Aunt Mildred did something, absolutely spectacular that you would like your community and your children to remember, right? So we pick and choose the men and the women who embody the values that we want to see in our communities. And that seems to me so obvious that I do get frustrated at the idea that it's, they're taking away our history, because our history, I mean, every monument and every memorial is a choice. And it's not a choice about, gee, I'll just memorialize any old piece of my history. It's about, I want a monument to someone who embodied the values that I want my community to share.
Right. So this brings me back to Obama. You mentioned his wonderful speech yesterday, eulogy, and but you also said something very interesting, which a lot of us have thought about, certainly in a lot of the progressives have, in ignoring the past wounds in favor of future hopes has not worked, and that Obama's politics were deliberately forward-looking. He avoided discussion of race. He refused to examine the devastating war waged in Iraq based on lies, and he refused to face the American crimes and the banking crisis, which you mentioned and thought that led to the election of Trump in 2016. I'd like you to talk about that, because a lot of us felt very frustrated that Obama just let it all pass and held nobody accountable.
I did too. I thought I couldn't be a stronger critic of an administration than I was of the second Bush administration during the war. And I was very loud and I was very vocal. And I even in my book, Moral Clarity, which I wrote as a response to his travesty of both words, it seemed to me at the time. I wrote a book, and I explicitly, in many ways attacked him. None of us could imagine that it could possibly get worse. And so, he's now being rehabilitated. But of course, I think we need to look at his policies and the policies of Ronald Reagan, which really changed America. There's no
Right.
question. On the other hand, I forgive Barack Obama everything, because the more I have come to understand, the more I've come to understand about the hatred he had to deal with. We saw a little bit of it in Mitch McConnell's, beginning, when the whole world was still celebrating Obama's victory, and seeing that as, oh yes, this is the America we always wanted to believe in, not just that it allowed a black man to be elected, but such a brilliant man of so much integrity and grace and all of that. The world was really celebrating, okay? And Mitch McConnell said our only goal is to make him a one-term president.
Exactly.
We did not say. Michelle has said in public, you don't know the half of the hate mail that we got. Even Fox News, when Malia got into Harvard, the comments were so disgusting that Fox News actually took them off her website. I mean, there were people writing, oh, did she get in as a monkey, as a Muslim, as an affirmative? I mean, just disgusting. As if Barack and Michelle Obama, anybody who looks at those people, did not make sure that their kids excelled in everything. Michelle once said that we told them they had to do 2 sports, they could choose which ones. We told, I mean, if anybody paid attention to their kids' education, so that Malia certainly got into Harvard on her own steam, it was Barack and Michelle Obama. But they were so horrible to them. And my guess is that where you live and where I live and the circles that we hang out in, we didn't pick that up. I was always, I was an Obama supporter very, very early on because I read his books. And when my friends were saying, Susan, you've lived in Europe too long, you don't understand that, an African-American intellectual is not going to become president of this country. It's the only time in my life that I actually called it before most people did. I've often been wrong. But, I, like everybody else, or not like everybody else, like a small group of people, I think Bush and Cheney and a few other people as well should have been indicted for war crimes. And we would not have had the chaos in Syria or ISIS or the refugee crisis in Europe had that war not been fought, okay? So I felt very strongly about that, and basically most people I know felt very strongly about that. And of course, I'm as far as the economics goes, I'm a socialist. I believe that which means that I believe that things like education, healthcare, labor rights, parental leave, paid vacation, sick leave, a whole bunch of things are human rights. I don't think all of our human rights are the right to talk and the right to travel. I think there's some more human rights. That's basically the difference for me between liberalism and socialism. So I would have been, very happy had he not called on Larry Summers to fix the financial crisis. On the other hand, I also understand that. Here was somebody running under incredible pressure, who's basically a constitutional lawyer who knows a hell of a lot about foreign policy and the Constitution, but he's not an economist. And I understand the impulse in the middle of what everybody was saying was going to be the greatest crisis since the Great Depression. I understand the impulse to sort of turn a little straighter and say, okay, someone once told me that both Larry Summers and Barack Obama think they're always the smartest men in the room. And so I understand the turn to Larry Summers, although I wish to hell he hadn't done it. And I
Paul Krugman would have been a better selection.
Oh, wouldn't have been wonderful. He would have been great. Yeah. And there are other people that he could have turned to. But here's the most important point. I do not think that the points on which I disagree with some of the policies of Obama are what led to the travesty that we now see in the White House. I think it was the underground racism and um, the inability to examine the past that led to that. And that is something that I really learned in my time in the Deep South. I always have to emphasize that when I focus my research on the Deep South, it was not because I don't believe that racism is a problem in the rest of the country. Of course it is.
Mm-hmm.
But, as we saw, the Klan has more members in Oregon. Well, in Oregon, it's different white supremacist groups, but it has more members in Indiana than it does in the Deep South. So, so I realized that. The interesting thing about the South is it works as a kind of magnifying glass because they really do think about their history. They may think wrong, they mythologize it, but you cannot say that, if you're in Mississippi in particular, you can't say, they're just leaving the past behind. They're not. They're talking about it all the time.
Right.
And what was so extraordinary to me was I could not, of course, interview anybody who would tell me why I didn't vote for, I didn't support Obama because I don't think a black family should be in the White House. I'm sure there are many people who thought that, but they wouldn't have said it to me.
Right.
Right? They would say, well, I don't like his policies. And then you would say, well, which ones? And I heard very interesting theories about, this is again from, liberal left-leaning Mississippians, about why the hostility to Obama was there. One person in New Orleans just said, white people don't want a black woman telling them what to eat.
Oh. And yet they were the cooks, right?
Right. Exactly.
The irony of it.
But that people objected to that. I mean, other people told me, and I did put that in the book, that they heard white people say, he will take revenge on us for crimes of segregation. And I would say, but he's half white and he hasn't done it yet.
Yeah, right.
Shouldn't that be a clear? No, they were afraid of that because deep in their hearts, they really do know about slavery and lynching and so on. But the most interesting, so it wasn't until I got to the South and left the two coasts that I picked up on the depth of the anti-Obama feeling. But the really, in a weird way, the most revealing thing for me was kind of like a little party trick that I would do to thank progressive people, black and white. I don't know if I'm sitting somewhere or showing them something. So in Monaco, Ireland, I happened to spend some time in the summer in Ireland. It's a country that I love and know well. They put up a national monument to the birthplace of Obama's great-great-grandfather on his mother's side. And it's a national monument, and he came to visit it, and there's a little museum, and talking about him and his trip there, and it's quite lovely. It's very moving.
What town is this?
Moneygall. It's spelled like money and then Gall. I may have a website. Anyway, I took some pictures of it, and I would show this to my white or black Southern friends, and they were astonished. They were just amazed that a foreign country would already, have this absolute, worship is the wrong word, enormous admiration for President Obama, that they would go to the trouble of making his great-great-grandfather's, tiny village a national historic monument, because they were so used to living in the South, this wave of hatred and total disrespect for this man. And that was where I began to see, I honestly think he did as good a job as he possibly could have done under the circumstances he was stuck in. And I've got to say, his eulogy last night for John Lewis convinced me of that all the more.
Yes, I understand. So we're going to open this up to questions from the people who are in our audience. Just one last thought, because we could have started with this, but now we're going to end with it instead. The Germans have this long 26 letter word that's alphabet sized, Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung or something like that.
Bad, yeah.
Okay, which means working off the past.
Right.
How do you see America dealing with working off the past in any way? Well, I mean, Germany obviously has been working on this, and both East and West. And I don't feel we have the same commitment or even understanding. We certainly have no word to describe working off the past. What do you think we can do, or what are your thoughts about how we can deal with it in this country?
I think we're doing it right now.
Okay, great.
We are doing it this very minute. And, you know, there were attempts. For me, the dating of American Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung is, again, another eulogy of President Obama's when he became the first high elected official to call for taking down the Confederate flag and connecting you know, the reverence for Confederate history, or the, you know, just simply the non-understanding of Confederate history with present day violence. And that was a moment in which Walmart said they weren't going to sell Confederate memorabilia, and you had two Republican governors taking down the flag. And you began this public discussion of what do these monuments mean? What don't we know about our history? So I think it began then. And I think that, you know, two things happened. We have seen under this administration, we have seen the racism rise. You know, it's quite crazy that a guy from Queens is basically running on re-election by defending Confederate monuments. I mean, really? You know,
Well, that's the craziest.
but that is what's happening. But I honestly think that because the man and his supporters revealed to the rest of the country, you know, including an awful lot of Republicans who were disgusted with it. I've never been a Republican. I've never, you know, certainly not since Nixon have I had any sympathy for anybody in the Republican Party, and they've always played with racism. I mean, both Nixon and Reagan did, and we shouldn't forget that. Okay?
Yeah, you have that quote from Nixon in your book.
Well, there's a quote from Nixon. There's also, you know, I talk about Philadelphia, Mississippi, where, you know, the three of my heroes, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, were murdered. I mean, Philadelphia, Mississippi is only famous for that. There's nothing else that happened there except that they have a big state fair once a year, okay? For Reagan to begin his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi was a dog whistle. I mean, it was a very loud dog whistle. And, you know, make a statement about states' rights in Philadelphia, Mississippi, to say, we won't prosecute, you know, go and lynch some more people, we won't prosecute.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
okay, so, but anyway, I mean, you know what? I don't even think he was saying that, although he certainly defended apartheid South Africa.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan did. I guess I've kind of been, maybe I've been bamboozled too by the image of the kindly grandfather Ronald Reagan to think he wouldn't have actually supported lynching. But, you know, he was certainly saying in Philadelphia, Mississippi, do what you like.
Right.
The feds
hands off, basically.
Yeah, the feds won't interfere. You know, so the Republicans have had this racist undercurrent for quite some time that has not been the party of Lincoln, but you know, it's been nothing like it's been in the last 3.5 years. And you see in things like the Lincoln Project, which has been producing these great ads, you see Republicans themselves being disgusted by the degree of racism that has come out with this administration. And I think it's that background, that was building. And the murder of George Floyd lit, there was a match that lit this, growing awareness of how deep our racist history runs, that led so many people, and so many white people, to stand up and say, this is not who we want to be. This is,
So I want to
but actually, I think we're doing it, and I have been in, despite the pandemic, which worries me, despite the troops in Portland, which I thought were supposed to leave yesterday, and I keep following that story, and I haven't seen that they've left yet.
they're leaving in stages.
Yeah. Right. Or the tweet that talks about delaying the election. I mean, there are a lot of things that worry me right now, but I have been incredibly buoyed and exhilarated by the intensity and the seriousness of the Black Lives Matter movement and what has happened in the last 2 months. And it's not only people demonstrating in the streets, it is so many people of so many different kinds and groups seriously sitting down and thinking, so what do we do next? How do we keep up the momentum? What projects, what proposals need to be taken seriously? This is actually one of my favorite things to think about. If we get rid of statues of traders and slave owners, who do we put in their place? Which heroes do we want to represent us? And I know these discussions are taking place because they write to me because of my book, and then I talk to them on Zoom. Is basically what I've been doing for the last 2 months. But I mean, a very diverse, serious group of people are thinking about how to go on, and it's wonderful.
Yeah, I think we are finally having a discussion of this. And rather, I don't want to get off into another thing of this because I do want to go to our questions, but I think it's interesting. The city-state of Dubrovnik, which was once 600 years was a independent city-state, they don't have statues and monuments.
Really?
Yeah, they have none. They have one, actually, they have one to a commoner who left all his money to the city and the welfare of the people. No other statues because they had no wars. They had no war heroes. They had no statues. So when you go there to the old city, you are filled with a completely different energy than this kind of worship or commemorating different people. It's more for the people themselves rather than looking up to somebody. Anyway, I don't want to go off on that. I'll talk to you about it a separate time because it's a fascinating history.
Liz, I've never been to Croatia, despite having a very good friend who's a Croatian writer. I've never been there. But I will only respond by saying I've been in plenty of other cities which have monuments to their poets and
yes, that's a different thing.
Writers and artists and musicians, and it doesn't have to be war heroes.
Right.
Lots of different kinds of heroes.
Yes.
But, yeah.
So I want to go to some of the questions, and I know we've got one from Maxine, but I want to ask first, because we read your book in our book club, if there's anyone in our book club who would like to ask a question first. Is there anyone from the book club? I'm looking to see if your hands are up, and if not, no, you're not. Okay, so Maxine, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? I don't know where she.
I first of all, I feel a little shy. Secondly, I got a little lost in the beginning because what drew me to this talk was the title, Learning from the Germans. And I'm Jewish, and I'm on a spiritual path. I'm originally from South Africa, and I have this deep interest in looking at the inner process of racism and projection on the other. So in a way, I was looking for more of a Jungian kind of talk, and it was like getting very political, but actually I've enjoyed it and I've learned a lot. So that's all I want to really say.
Well, that's very kind of you. You do know that Jung was quite close to the Nazis.
Yes,
Oh
this is a
God,
good point.
shocking.
And it's one reason why I have read very little Jung. I've read a little bit. I've read a lot of Freud, but he was very close to the Nazis.
Mhm.
Oh, interesting.
That shocked me when I read it. I had been very interested in Jung, and when I found that out, I thought, I guess he's not who I thought he was. I mean, we're
You know,
many people. We have many parts to us, I think. And anyway, I won't go off into that. There's another question that I'll ask if we don't have a
years
question coming
ago,
up.
years ago, just before I left South Africa, I watched a video with Lawrence van der Post, who was very much a student of Jung, and he talked about racism as very often we project the disowned shadow on the other. And so, of course, if you're in a country where there are people with dark skin, what more obvious than, wow, they've got dark skin, so you project the shadow onto them. And I remember just he had some fascinating images, and it was very much in the light of Jungian thinking.
Well, please don't take me as saying that every Jungian is a Nazi. I don't believe
No, I
that.
don't.
But
I don't.
but but I'm just saying Carl Jung really was. Um, now, what is certainly right about that thought is, and it's something I do talk about in the book. It's quite interesting. The whole racist idea that black men, you need to protect white women from black men because all black men want to rape white women. Who was raped in the United States? Look at the color of African Americans as compared to Africans. They know that their grandmothers and great grandmothers were all regularly raped, and not even raped. Well, rape is a complicated. It's not just lust; it's power. It's all kinds of things. But with the slave owners, it was worse. They were producing children to sell. Okay, it was a deliberate policy to rape their slaves in order to produce children to sell. So the fear of black men raping white women is sheer projection.
Right.
No question about that. And if that's a Jungian idea, then okay, Jung came up with something interesting.
Okay, we have a question now from Matt.
Hi, I read your book in a book group, and I was one of the most important things I got from it was page 68 to 69 that Germans express shame
We're having
for the
trouble hearing you, Matt.
Holocaust, whereas America really only expresses regret for slavery. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the difference is between expressing regret or apology and
Matt, we're not getting what you're saying.
Can you hear me?
Your
No?
sound is not great, but I think I
I
understand.
unmuted myself.
Yeah, but
You're lagging.
your
You're lagging.
reception-
It's your internet connection. It's not the quality of your
Hello.
audio. You're
Yeah,
Now
off.
I
really
can hear
bad.
anybody.
Did you get the sense of it, Susan?
Let me ask you.
Can't hear anybody.
Yeah, it's
Um,
I'll type
you know
to
what, can you type your question into the chat function?
Good idea. Matt, type your question into the chat box. And in the meantime, while you're typing, I'm going to go to Ben. Do you want to unmute Ben?
There you go.
Yeah.
Thank you, Georgia. I've been looking forward to this talk and I think a lot of the
Okay, sorry.
a lot of the same reasons that you have been interested in what's happening with this tremendous resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in the last few months in the United States. And I think that, we have to understand that there has been an oscillation of the national or civic narrative.
Yeah.
Is someone else got their
I'm trying to see if
somebody's got their needs
I
to
think
be.
you need to mute Matt, and
It's the
then
same
I
guy.
did
I
mute
think you got to
him.
mute him.
oh, okay.
Okay. Anyway, so one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is that most of these statues were built in two periods. They were built during the 1920s, during the Wilson administration. Wilson himself was the, descendant of many generations of Klan people. He was the person who gave the presidential imprimatur to the first blockbuster film that came out of Hollywood, Birth of a Nation, which was like straight up, basically lost cause racism. And that narrative became the dominant national civic narrative during that period of time. It went into eclipse during the Roosevelt administration, but it then came back again. There was a recrudescence of these Confederate monuments in the 50s, following this, leading up to, because of Eisenhower and other administrations desegregating the schools. So these are fairly recent phenomena. And all of them, to me, seem to have the same theme in common, which is that there's this bit of undigested history. We never got finished with the Civil War, and now it's coming back to bite us in spades. And my understanding about the Germans was that they did this very thorough cultural re-examination to try to purge not just the words and the symbols, but the actual attitudes and values of what it means to be a German citizen. I'm wondering, is it possible to do that here in this country?
It is coming out in paperback. I'd urge you to read my book because, it was a long and difficult process. And in a certain sense, the main thing we have to learn from the Germans is how hard it was. They didn't want to do it. One of the things that was most crucial for my own understanding of this process was reading post-war West German accounts, and they didn't say it out loud. You have to really look, and there were certain presses that published it, or certain memoirs. They sounded just like the defenders of the lost cause. We lost the war, our cities were, in ashes, our men were wounded or imprisoned, our women were violated, our children were hungry, and on top of that, the damn Yankees want to accuse us of starting the war. I swear to you, this was the West German, attitude. And for me, that is a reason for us to hope, because I think it's quite natural for people to push back. So my thesis is we would all like our people to be heroes. It's a very natural view that we get as children. We heroicize our parents, even if our parents are horrible people, unfortunately, as psychotherapists have seen in studying cases of real abuse, right? It's very hard for an abused child to distance themselves from their parents because your parents are your parents, right? But if you have found out that your parents were abusers or that your nation was fascist, it's often the next normal stage is to see your nation as a victim or your parents as victims, right? And this is the way the South still feels to this day in many ways. And it is the way that the West Germans felt. Really, you even see little bits of it, in certain pockets today, and right-wing pockets. But the third stage, which the Germans did do, and that set a historical precedent, was to say, yeah, we suffered, but actually other people suffered worse, and it was our fault. And, that set a historical precedent that I think we can follow. But I bring up the German example not just to show, or I emphasize the book is about that, not just to show that they did something that we still have yet to do. They still have a lot to do as well, by the way. It's not as if everything is perfect, but precisely to show how hard it was. And when I was down in Mississippi, basically based at an Institute for Racial Reconciliation, people found who kept seeing how hard it was to try and move people away from white supremacy. They found it incredibly cheering to know that it had even been hard for the Germans to acknowledge their, their national crimes. And that's, yeah, so I think that's something that should give us hope. By the way, Wilson, and I do talk about this in the book, it's not only that he gave a presidential seal of approval to, the first film shown in the White House. If you look at that damn film, it contains a quote from Wilson. Since it's a silent film, of course, they have to use quotes. It has a quote from Woodrow Wilson saying, "And finally there arose in the South the great Ku Klux Klan to defend the Aryan nation." When I finally saw that, I decided that the battles over renaming the Woodrow Wilson School in Princeton were not. At first, I wasn't sure, and then when I saw that quote,
that was it.
Yeah.
I think what Matt was asking here, which is in the chat box, if you take a look at it, is related to this. Germans express shame for the Holocaust while Americans only express regret for slavery. How can we talk about this? Why are Americans unwilling to accept shame for the evil of slavery and for the massacre of the Native Americans?
Well, first of all, I can only recommend Brian Stevenson. Basically, everything that Brian Stevenson does, I interviewed him in the book. There's an incredible podcast that he just gave to Ezra Klein, like last week, which I strongly recommend people to listen to. One of the themes he talks about in that podcast, Brian Stevenson, among other things, is the creator of the National Lynching Memorial, and he is someone who has learned from Germany, had told me that, and uses the German example. One of the things he said in that podcast was, listen, I'm not trying to punish people by making them focus on the history of lynching. I'm trying to heal, and he really is. And one of the things that he told me was, without shame, nothing changes. One of the reasons that we don't feel shame is that so many of us are so far from slavery that it doesn't feel connected to our lives. And of course, most white Americans came to this country after the end of the Civil War and all of the immigrations from all the different places that started in the 1880s. So we have no direct connection to slavery, and it's very easy to say this is not our problem. What we don't know, and again, this is a quote from Brian Stevenson, slavery didn't end in 1865, it evolved. And it's because of our ignorance of the period from 1865 to 1955, when the civil rights movement really began, that we're allowed not to feel shame because we're not connected to it. But actually, from the black codes to the lynchings it's now said, ironically, driving while black, he was stopped for driving while black or whatever. The black codes genuinely criminalized African American behavior that was perfectly normal for anybody who was white. And they deliberately constructed the image that we now have of African Americans as likely to be criminal. Before this, there were racist stereotypes. They were seen as lazy, they were seen as stupid, but they were not seen primarily as threats, which is how they're seen now and why they are murdered at such a higher rate than white people. So I think the way to move us towards a helpful shame, a shame that allows us to say, yeah, actually, these were my people too. It wasn't just, you know, those slave owners in Mississippi who I may have no connection to at all. I don't. You know, my family's from, you know, I'm a Jew from Russia and Poland. I mean, my one grandparent and the rest of them great grandparents are also, we have nothing to do with slavery, but we did benefit from the systemic racism that was not just a matter of individual prejudice, but law that was baked into this country. I mean, another example, you know, when FDR introduced Social Security, the only way he could get it through the Senate, and you asked about the hold early in the conversation, about the hold of the South on the rest of the country. He could only get it through the Senate because Southern senators insisted that agricultural and domestic laborers be exempted from Social Security. Now, how high was the percentage of agricultural and domestic laborers among African Americans? 70%, okay? So, you know, it's things like that, it's the GI Bill. All of those are things that we need to confront as being connected to us and not just to some crazy people in the South. Here's somebody saying, shame is controversial in the recovery. I don't know what else the chat says. I do know, by the way, that so this institute that I was affiliated with used to, one of their mottos was no shame, no blame. You know, we just want to work this out. And I understand that it's controversial, but it's actually Stevenson who convinced me, as well as looking at the Germans, that if you don't feel some shame, it doesn't become personal for you. And you therefore are not moved to create change. Now, you know, this is a generational project, and it's been a generational project for the Germans. It's not a project that, you know, I keep telling people in a time of a pandemic, it's not a vaccine. It's not a one shot and you're no longer a racist and you don't have any, you know, you don't have to worry about anything more. It's a process that will have to go on for several generations. That's biblical, by the way. There's some question about whether it's 3 or 4 generations in the Bible. But the thing is, if we're counting how long an American working off the past is going to take, we cannot count from 1865. We need to count from 1964 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah. I think we have Philip Beard next. We have 4 people with their hands up, but wanted to go to Philip next. Where are you, Philip?
Here I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Susan, one of the things that's bothered me ever since I became an adult about U.S. popular culture is the lionization of the military and the idea that all of our men and women in uniform are somehow serving the legitimate interests of our country. And they get glorified all the time. You know, every time you hear an announcer at a baseball game or something like that talking about the service people who are in attendance at the game and we thank you for your service, et cetera, et cetera. It so rubs me the wrong way because the whole notion of American militarism has nothing to do with genuine patriotism, which is trying to make our country as good as it can possibly be. Rather, it is a glorification of imperialism. And I'm wondering about Germany and how, what the current discourse amounts to about questions of to what extent are we justifiably proud of our country, and to what extent are we justifiably proud of our soldiers who play some kind of a role, whether misguided or idealistic, some kind of a role in promoting our national identity. Is there, Well, you've mentioned the role that shame plays in trying to come to grips with our past. Is there some way that the Germans have satisfactorily dealt with the glorification of the military? And if there is there some way that we could learn from that for the United States?
That's a whole bunch of good questions. Let me try to answer them briefly so that other people get a turn. Look, Germany is very anti-military. One quite interesting fact, by the way, about the military, among at least all the places that I've lived, I mean, which basically come down to, no, but there's more. I mean, I've lived in Israel, lived and worked in Israel and the US and Germany. They all describe it as defense force, right? We have a Department of Defense. We don't have a Department of Militarism, right?
Right.
Of imperialism, we have a Department of Defense. It's only a defensive maneuver, which is, of course, you know, it's another lie. Yes, thank you. So look, you couldn't find anyone to agree with you more about American imperialism. I'm appalled and ashamed at the way, to this day, you know, from the blockade of Cuba to the, you know, war in Iraq, I could not be more ashamed of the role that the U.S. military has played certainly in the last more than 100 years. And also more ashamed of the fact that as I was growing up, I didn't understand it. I had to become much older and read a lot of books, you know, I guess I sort of grew up during the Vietnam War, and there it was clear we had no business being there.
Right.
And it is still the case that, you know, even liberals like Ken Burns' 18-hour Vietnam movie doesn't really question what the hell we were doing there. And he sort of explains, but he doesn't, you know, you see pictures of war hero, so-called war heroes like John McCain is revered.
Yeah.
It was so awful that he was imprisoned and tortured. He was bombing civilians in Hanoi, you know? Kind of unsurprising that they were pretty angry at him.
Yeah.
But, okay. All of that notwithstanding, I have an ambivalent attitude towards the military because the men and women who now serve, first of all, a lot of them do it simply because it's the only way to get out of poverty. It's the only way to get an education and health care for many, many people, especially African Americans in the South. But one of the things that has struck me, and I don't know quite how to put it together with the actual foreign policy, which I hate, is the fact that the military instills an ethos of service, which is quite genuine and very, very different from the ethos or lack thereof that we're seeing from this White House, for example, where it's, you know, nothing matters except greed and, you know, maybe, you know, a blonde, long-legged blonde. You know, otherwise nothing matters, right? And, you know, the individual service people that I have met, and also I've talked to other people around this, actually care about something other than their own material self-interest. One of the things that I found most moving from Portland, of all the moving things in Portland, were the white veterans who came out when somebody's hand was broken, right? I mean, incredible. But, and you had this line of white demonstrators wearing Black Lives Matter t-shirts, linking arms, and saying, we serve to protect the Constitution, which guarantees the right to free assembly. I think there's a big split between the foreign policy and the individual ethos, which is worth paying attention to. We didn't pay attention to it during the Vietnam War, and we demonized individual soldiers. And I think that led to a split in the country, which was very problematic, okay? has Germany done something? Germany is amazingly anti-materialist, militaristic, amazingly. There used to be a draft, but you could get out of it very easily simply by doing a national service of some kind, working in a hospital or, you know, a home for orphans or, you know, whatever, mutatis mutandis. They abolished the draft. I'm trying to remember exactly when it was. I mean, 7, 8 years ago, something like that, because they simply didn't need them because Germany is so opposed to any kind of militarist intervention that it was very hard. I mean, if you noticed, I mean, during the Iraq War, they were deeply opposed to it. They were willing to, and it's a NATO thing, of course, they were willing to send some kind of support to Afghanistan. There are a few troops, German troops in Afghanistan still, but the country as a whole, I mean, it's as if they just simply, 2 world wars was enough. There, it was just a kind of natural disgust. You don't see any of the kinds of phenomena that you're talking about in Germany.
Okay, I'd like to go to Barry. I'm going to unmute you. And Susan, if you tell me if you've had enough, we could.
Let's say
Okay.
my limit before I kind of drop is an hour and a half. So let's say we've got 10 minutes,
Okay.
or
right.
maybe 15.
Okay, Barry, you're next.
Yes, Susan, I greatly appreciate your comments. And I particularly related to the concept of shame, in that Americans don't feel this shame connected to segregation and slavery. I felt it most of my life. I come from a Jewish background. I come from a very, very rural Southern background. And my Jewish, so-called Jewish family and so-called family were racial supremacists. They fully embraced the Southern way. They just didn't conform. They were true believers. The last time I went down south, I spent most of my time in the South in the 40s. Like in the 40s, I was born in 42, and in the early 50s. The last time I went down to the South was in the early 60s, and at that time, the deaths of the 3 civil rights workers were revealed. And in this small Southern town, you know, the reaction of the white populace, it was celebration. It was a good thing.
What's the town?
I'm sure you've never heard of it. It's called Ahoskie, Ahoskie.
You're
It
right.
is south of Sutton, Virginia,
Yeah, okay.
and it is Klan country. My father was a Northerner, and eventually he banned some of my Southern relatives from the house because they were Klan supporters, and they would go to Klan rallies. One of them, who was a district attorney in a small Southern town, was made an honorary member of the Klan.
Although he was Jewish.
He was Jewish. He was made an honorary. He was Jewish.
Jews too.
The Klan did not accept Jews,
Well, they not only didn't.
And they were anti-Semitic, yes. But no matter with my family, they were at the core Southerners, and eventually, once I started speaking my mind, I was simply labeled as mentally ill. And as people who deviated from the line, they were traitors. They were not welcome in the South. I hear some of these Southerners of the old genre. They're still around. The Jesse Helms Democrats are still around. Trump is a combination of Jesse Helms and Roy Cohn. He speaks to that. Constituency. And eventually, my experiences in the South brought me into the Holocaust studies, because my family didn't talk about the Holocaust as well. And when I heard you had you spent some significant time in Georgia, and then
I-
all this work.
I lived there till my 13th year.
Yes.
I'm going to want you to kind of close it
But
up,
you
Barry.
would
Barry?
be differentiated.
Barry?
You're an urban person.
Yeah, okay, good, because we've got two more people who want to ask a question.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being here, Susan. I greatly appreciate you and your book. I thoroughly relate to everything, but to get other Americans moored into our history is very, very difficult. And the Southerners that I was aware of, they still are into the lost cause.
So let me just answer that by saying, look, I know, because I met some people like that too, but Bryan Stevenson, for anybody who doesn't know who Bryan Stevenson is, he is African American. Bryan Stevenson told me, and I quote him in the book, remember that there were white Southerners who stood up against lynching. Remember that there were white Southerners who stood up against segregation. You don't know their names, and it's really important that we remember those names. So there were some, and there's, you know, and of course there are more now, but let's not demonize the whole South. You know.
Good point. Okay, Steve Behrman. Do you want to, there we go.
I did. Thank you. First of all, I want to acknowledge that, Susan, you know, my first graduate program was at Antioch, and one of my fellow students there, who was 20 years older than me, was Buford Posey from Philadelphia, Mississippi. And Buford was cousins with the people who killed the civil rights workers, and he was a white civil rights worker who took his life in his hands by his courageous attitude. He was a good old boy. I mean, he had smoked these cigars that he cut in half. He was a genuine Southern good old boy, but he was one of those people who actually took a stand. So I just want to acknowledge that.
Thank you.
Secondly, you know, you're mentioning of the military, and you're acknowledging that the military actually has a code of ethics, and they're up to something. One of the big problems in this country since the Vietnam War has been the culture wars, where essentially all of the compassion has been put into one tribe and all of the valor has been put into the other. And that's really created a misunderstanding of what valor is and an abuse of that valor, as you had suggested, by what these soldiers have had to defend. Many of them coming from a place of wanting to do something of value. So that's kind of my comment on that. And the question that I wanted to ask is, in looking at what happened in South Africa with truth and reconciliation, what are the prospects for truth, reconciliation, reparations, and forgiveness in a national conversation that's not mediated by the media and not mediated by any political party or government, to actually bring people together in this country to actually address this wound thoroughly, hear one another, and be able to move on from a position of we've dealt with it?
So look, in West Germany, there was no national attempt to bring people together to talk about it. There was a national attempt at repression. East Germany was different. There was a national anti-fascist policy. In West Germany, it was not. It was small groups in civil society coming together like you are, and like many, many other people are all over the country. You know, to do just this work that's happening now. Ideally, we'd have great leadership and civil society. At the moment, of course, we have the opposite of leadership. And look, we'll see. You know, I voted for Sanders in the primary, and I'm very sorry he didn't become the nominee. I'm hoping that he'll, you know, his people have been trying to work out a platform that's closer to the things that I believe than Joe Biden's very centrist history. But, you know, Joe Biden has been moved by Black Lives Matter too. It's very clear. That's not, you know, I mean, he knows he needs the votes, but he also, something has changed in his own rhetoric. So, I mean, you don't need a national order. And in fact, in many ways, I'm pleased at what's happening in these different communities, because otherwise if there's an authoritarian directive from above saying now you all have to be anti-racist, it's not going to work. Let me just tell you about a letter that I got a couple of days ago, which I was moved by more than any letter I have gotten. Was somebody who was a police chief. He was a policeman in Arizona, then he moved. He was a police chief in Savannah, Georgia. And he wrote to say, I wish I had read your book before I retired. I would have been a better public servant. I wish I could turn back time. And I wrote to him, I was just, wow, gosh, great. This is what you hope words can do. And I wrote to him and said, look, don't turn back time. There's a lot you can do now. Your voice will have much more authority with younger police officers than mine will. Get on social media. Unfortunately, since I'm not a huge fan of social media, but we're living through an international pandemic, and talk to people. And now today he answered back with a really long and interesting and thoughtful letter about what he thinks is wrong with the police system. I haven't even had time to digest that whole letter because he said, I'm sorry for being blabby, but it's a very long letter. One of the things that I learned from the letter was, he says, in the state of Georgia, in order to become a hair cutter, you need 1,500 hours of training to get a certificate. He says, there are no requirements in most places to become a police officer. Mm-hmm. There's, he says, of course, it's state by state and sometimes county to county, but he said he was shocked that he was hired as a police chief, that they didn't check references, that they didn't, that he didn't have to undergo any tests. And suddenly he said he was given a weapon and the law and the ability, and he is clearly a decent man who thinks about these things. But that is an astonishing fact. 1,500 hours of study to become a hairdresser and nothing to become a police officer.
So to become president of the United States?
Oh, yeah. Exactly. Anyway, I want to kind of, end. I can answer one more question. I want to end on a hopeful note, which is just to emphasize that, they're very different groups of people. You're clearly a very different group of people than I'm assuming this police chief hangs out with. Mm-hmm. But people are talking about this. They're doing the work. And we just need to keep it up. That's all. And get everybody we know. Somebody mentioned, who are kind of my childhood heroes. I was too young to join Freedom Summer, but it sure is where I would have liked to have been had I been old enough to join. I, feel like urging everybody I know, and unfortunately I'm stuck here in Berlin, and so I can't do it on the ground, but I had been planning to do something. Those young men died for the right to vote. In their memory, let's remember that story, and in their memory, make sure that everyone we know and everyone they know is registered to vote. There is an Andrew Goodman Memorial Foundation which deals with voting rights issues, and that is if people want to donate, or it was founded by Goodman's brother, who I guess is still the chair of it. But I think stories are really good ways to go. I think inspiration is important, and for all that, particularly people who may have been disappointed that the Democratic nominee is who he is, need to be motivated to get out there and vote the bastard out.
Do you want to take one more, or are you
No, I can take one more and then I'm quitting.
Okay, this is from John, who has been helping with the process today. So go ahead, John.
Hey, thanks again, Susan. I loved the book. It was very difficult for me to read because it's extremely thought-provoking and applicable. I just wanted to ask, how central is economic inequality to racism and the underlying sentiments? For example, in examinations of the misinformation campaigns that produced Trump's widespread popularity among the poor and undereducated, uh, one of the most common sentiments was the inability of poor whites to feel that they have any sort of privilege. So I guess a more finer, a sharp question is do more robust social safety nets and less threat to baseline living conditions help racism recede naturally? I mean, is it possible that we're putting the cart before the horse a little, approaching this rhetorically, or is that just my own privilege as a white dude speaking?
So look, again, a complicated question. Let me see if I'm still coherent enough to give a coherent answer. Stop calling it a social safety net and stop calling it a benefit. Where I live, that is in Europe, everyone has a right to the things that are called safety nets or benefits. And it would be as silly to suggest that, you trade. I mean, it's as if somebody said, well, you've had too much freedom of speech this year. You've written too many blog posts, so you don't get to travel. It would be as silly to think that, but I mean, that strikes us as very silly. But for Europeans, and not just Scandinavians, people are always pointing to small, wealthy, white, homogenous Scandinavia. And they never point to Germany, which is the fourth largest economic power in the world. We have rights of which Bernie Sanders does not dare to dream. I shock people by saying that Bernie Sanders is to the right of Angela Merkel, who is a centrist conservative. She is. None of her voters would accept the mild reforms that Bernie Sanders proposed, okay? Because it has been for over 100 years, they're conceived of as rights, yeah? And I'm saying words make a huge difference. If you conceive of rights, if something is a right, well, then you'll fight for it in the way that some people will fight for the Second Amendment. Here's a little example. One of the things, so Europeans are all aware enough of American politics that they know that America has no universal health care policy, and that is part of the problem in an international pandemic. But I also have to explain to them that we don't have sick leave either. And they cannot wrap their heads around it. So Germans don't have sick leave either, as in a fixed number of days that your employer grants you as a benefit. They have something else. It's called writing sick. If you're sick for 3 days, all you have to do is call your employer and say you're sick. If you're sick for more than 3 days, you have to go and get a note from your doctor estimating how long you're going to be sick. In Holland, which I believe is the most generous, you can be written sick for 102 weeks. In Poland, which is the least generous, you can be written sick for 50 days. But when I try and explain to Europeans, they say, well, what if somebody's got cancer? Or what if somebody says, that's the break. So I am entirely in favor of shifting our perception from safety net to social rights. That is why I'm a socialist, okay? But the other thing that I want to add is it is a myth that, God, I hate saying his name, although one of my daughters keeps saying that's too coy, we need to say his name, Trump. Trump supporters, we would love to think of them as poor white trash. Those are the ones who get in the paper, or rather on the news. There have been many studies done the average Trump voter was much wealthier than the average Clinton voter, and just as educated. They don't want you to know this, but you know, more than half of his supporters have above average incomes and college degrees, and they want the tax cuts. It's incredible. I mean, they want the tax cuts and they're happy with the racism. It's incredible to me. I find this extremely hard to believe, but there have been so many studies done on the numbers that I have to trust them. They're all really very reliable. The interesting thing is we have the same myth about the Nazis. We like to think that the Nazis were this mob of uneducated people, and if only people had been educated, you know, they wouldn't have come to power. You have exactly the same phenomenon. The highest proportion of Nazi Party members had college degrees, which was actually quite rare at the time. It's still rarer in Germany than in the US because there are alternate forms of education. So don't let them fool you that it's the great unwashed masses and their economic insecurity that has brought about this presidency. We do have economic inequality, we do have economic insecurity, and we should, you know, move much closer towards a European model of social rights. By the way, the person who asked the question about militarism, you know, the military budget, there's an awful lot of things we could do with that military budget if we weren't concerned to establish bases all over the world. So, you know, it's all feasible, it's all financeable, and Germany has done it. So yeah, anyway, I'm starting to rant and get tired. And
Thank you.
kept you on a long time, Susan, and I'm sorry for that, but this has been an incredible meeting, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very interesting questions, and it's been a pleasure to meet you.
I can
Thank you,
unmute you all
Susan.
so we can clap.
It was great. It was great. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan.
I listened to you all day long.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susan.
Keep up the engagement, and you know, together we'll get there. As President Obama said last, we won't get there all at once.
I'm going to email you, Susan, because I have some other things I want to talk to you about.
Wow, that's great.
Thank you.
All right, you're very welcome. Bye-bye.
And bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Anyone want to stay on for a minute?
Thank you. That's great. I was just going to say one quick thing. She gave I have a new definition for Hillary's comment about deplorables.
Right.
Because they're well educated and they got a lot of dough, and I never would have thought that way.
Yeah.
Deplorable.
They weren't, well, they're still deplorables. They're just educated.
No, she was great.
Deplorables without excuse. They're
Really
slumming.
Well, there's a pretty good indicator that education was one of the better indicators. They look at the top 50 most educated counties and the bottom 50 most educated, and the margins compared to Hillary Clinton, compared to Obama. Obama won like 12% more of the I think it's like he won a bunch. Obama did much better with the uneducated, and Hillary did, like the line shifted to, I don't know, just read the article, but the line shifted to education.
Wow. Yeah.
But yeah, thanks.
Well, glad to have you all on today. And all the questions, I think we got to everybody who put their hand up anyway, which is great. And I will send, and we'll get the chat box edited and send it out. If you don't receive it, because there are more people on this call today, and I don't know that I've got everybody's name here, but I'll try to get to everybody.
Yeah, Georgia, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you for being on the show.
Really great. Yeah.
Well, next week we've got another philosopher, more of a spiritual bent, Richard Tarnas.
Thanks, Georgia. It was great. Very enlightening.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye, Georgia.
Bye, everybody.
Look like the Swami guy.
The Swami's there. Hi, Swami. Oh, Swami. Did he go? I guess he's gone. Okay.